December 17, 1944. The coldest night of the Ardennes slams into the 394th like a steel door, freezing every U.S. vehicle solid and trapping the battalion in place with no help coming. At 28°, engines turned to white statues, dipsticks glazed in silver crystals, the motor pool transformed into a graveyard of ice. Only a sagging maintenance tent throws a faint circle of warmth into the dark, where mechanics fight the cold with numb hands and fading hope. And in that shrinking light, one engineer crouches over a jerry can, mixing a forbidden oil blend, an unapproved gamble that could kill every engine instantly, or bring a frozen battalion back to life before the enemy closes the trap. The 394th Infantry Battalion had been thrust into isolation after the sudden German counterattacks that marked the opening chaos of the Battle of the Bulge. The men were accustomed to hardship, but the cold had surpassed anything their training had warned them about. Standard Army motor oil, CLA-30, reliable in normal winter conditions, had thickened into a wax-like mass that refused to move, locking engines solid. Even the best-maintained vehicles, 2.5-ton GMC trucks, M8 armored cars, and a few M4 tractors were reduced to frozen shells. They held supplies, ammunition, and hope, yet none could start, not with the oil congealed, and the metal contracted so tightly that even cranks refused to budge. Logistics had failed them at the worst moment. Resupply convoys had been delayed more than 36 hours, lost somewhere behind disrupted roads and enemy movement. Somewhere in the long supply chain sat the cold weather lubricants intended for this front, but they would not arrive today or tomorrow, and the battalion could not wait. Mechanics tried the usual field thawing techniques: stoves under oil pans, open flame heaters against engine blocks, but the cold was too deep, the metal too stubborn, and time too short. Every attempt ended the same way: engines refusing to turn, oil refusing to flow. In the midst of this frozen paralysis, Staff Sergeant Walt Hensley moved with a deliberate calm. At 32, he carried the quiet confidence of a man who had spent his life repairing machines on Iowa farmland, pushing equipment through winters that could freeze fuel lines solid overnight. Now he served as the battalion's motor maintenance NCO, and the problem before him was not just mechanical, it was existential. If the vehicles did not move soon, the battalion would be forced to abandon them and attempt a breakout on foot through the snow. In these temperatures, with dwindling supplies and rising enemy activity, the consequences would be severe, even without a single shot fired. Hensley studied the silent line of vehicles, gauging their weight, their frozen stiffness, and the long stretch of forest beyond them. When he finally stepped toward the battalion commander, he carried not a tool or a report, but a dented jerrycan filled with something the Army had never authorized, and something that might be the only path out. The next morning sharpened the cold into something almost metallic, a hard-edged presence that moved with the wind as it skimmed crystals across the snow like ground glass. The forest felt even more silent than the night before, as if the cold itself absorbed every vibration. Inside the maintenance tent, where the thin warmth from the stove barely pushed back the freezing air, Walt Hensley sat hunched over a grease-stained notebook. A lantern flickered beside him, its light carving shadows across the rough sketches he drew, crude flow curves, slope lines bending downward with temperature drops, viscosity estimates pulled from memory rather than manuals. The vapor of his breath drifted over the pages, fogging the ink for a moment before fading. Equations like these belonged in a machine shop or an engineering classroom, not on a battlefield where artillery rumbled in the distance. Yet this was the only place he could apply them. Here, in a frozen tent surrounded by immobilized vehicles, the math mattered more than any order. Hensley's entire life had been shaped by winters harsher than most people ever experienced. Growing up on an Iowa farm meant facing engines that refused to start after nights that froze the ground solid beneath the barns. He learned young that machines responded to patience, intuition, and an understanding of how cold altered every moving part. As a rural mechanic, he had spent countless mornings coaxing tractors back to life when their heavy oils thickened into stubborn glue. More than once he had experimented with thinning those oils using kerosene, applying his own improvised ratios when blizzards forced solutions that manuals never mentioned. What he lacked in formal engineering credentials, he made up for in the quiet confidence of hands that had learned through repetition and failure. That knowledge now lived at the front of his mind. Viscosity indexes, pour points, flash points, the behavior of paraffinic oils when temperatures plunged far below freezing. He ran through them while studying the sample jars of standard Army motor oil that had turned to opaque sludge overnight. The official lubrication doctrine of 1944 acknowledged the need for Arctic-grade oils, but the supply chain prioritized ammunition, rations, and fuel, leaving specialized lubricants rarely stocked near the front. For a battalion placed under sudden strain by a desperate offensive, that shortage had become a trap. The battalion's position made the situation even more precarious. They were surrounded on three sides, with fuel stores dwindling to roughly 40% as men burned precious gasoline for heat. Without mobile vehicles, the entire unit would remain pinned in a pocket that could tighten at any moment. The responsibility resting on Hensley's shoulders was heavy, not because anyone demanded a miracle from him, but because he understood precisely what failure meant. Modifying the oil without authorization risked reprimand or worse. Using an unapproved mix risked damaging engines so severely that no amount of thawing could save them. It was a choice between regulation and survival, between the rules he respected and the intuition he trusted. He paused and lifted a small metal cup containing his experimental blend. As he tilted it under the lantern's glow, the thin amber smear inside shifted, slowly, resistant to the cold, yet undeniably alive. In that subtle movement lay the first hint that the battalion's fate might change. Night settled early and heavily, pressing the forest into a depth of darkness that felt almost weight-bearing. The temperature dropped further, turning the air into a sharp, unmoving mass and reducing the world outside the tent to shifting outlines and distant artillery murmurs. Inside, the lantern cast a faint, trembling glow over the fabric walls, and in that narrow circle of light, Hensley knelt beside 4 containers arranged with careful intention. 2 carried SAE-30 motor oil that had thickened nearly to paste, 1 held diesel, drawn from the battalion's shrinking supply, and the last contained aviation-grade hydraulic fluid, quietly siphoned from a grounded liaison aircraft earlier that afternoon. Each can represent a piece of a puzzle he once solved in a different life, under different circumstances, and now had to refine to a level the cold would not reject. The engineering constraint weighed on him more than the temperature. Engine bearings required a minimum level of film strength to prevent internal scoring, and thinning the oil too aggressively risked turning every engine into an irreparable casualty of cold. He knew the boundaries, knew the limits of lubrication under stress, and understood the unforgiving nature of sub-zero failures. As he dipped a metal rod into the drum beside him, the oil clung to it with the consistency of syrup, refusing to drip even after several seconds. Field measurements had shown that the standard oil stopped functioning at anything below 10 degrees Fahrenheit and became fully solid by -20, both thresholds long since surpassed. No engine could live on that. Hensley's mind drifted to memories of far different winters, pre-war mornings in Iowa, kneeling in a barn beside tractors that had frozen into stubborn silence. He remembered mixing farm oil with kerosene in an 80-20 ratio, coaxing machines to life at temperatures that would have defeated most crews. That experience offered a starting point now, but the stakes and conditions demanded something more precise. The cold here was sharper, more absolute, and the engines were not forgiving farm equipment. They were military machines, expected to run under strain immediately after ignition. A simple two-part blend would not be enough. He considered the properties of each fluid at hand, then committed to a tri-blend. 65% SA30 would preserve necessary base strength. 25% diesel would provide the viscosity reduction needed to make the mixture pour at these extreme temperatures. 10% aircraft hydraulic fluid, formulated for low-temperature stability, would counteract gelling and give the mixture its chance to remain fluid in the coldest hours before dawn. The ratios formed a narrow bridge between risk and necessity, between mechanical theory and survival. Working with a field burner set to its lowest safe setting, Hensley warmed the base oil until it softened enough to accept the additional components. He stirred the mixture using two stripped rifle cleaning rods taped together, moving with slow, even sweeps to avoid trapping air. As he worked, he mentally plotted the expected viscosity curve, using rough multiplier approximations and intuition shaped by years of improvisation. A few soldiers watched from the tent entrance, their expressions divided between hope and unease as he marked the jerry can with a simple, unmistakable label. Temp cold mix. Not approved. Then a shell burst somewhere beyond the tree line, its concussive shock racing through the ground. The tent shuddered, the lantern flickered once, and the flame extinguished, plunging the interior into sudden blackness. The half-mixed solution sloshed softly in the dark, its fate and their own hanging in the cold hours that still lay ahead. Before dawn, the cold deepened into something almost sculptural, layering every surface with a hard, white armor that captured the faint starlight. Frost curled along the curved hoods of the trucks, turning them into pale silhouettes lined with crystal edges. Hensley moved through this frozen stillness with a careful, practiced deliberation, each exhale hanging like a brief burst of smoke before dissolving into the heavy air. His gloves stiffened from the cold as he positioned a tent heater beneath the sump of a GMC 1 to 2-ton truck, letting the heat slowly loosen the solidified mass inside. Patience became as important as precision. Too much heat could warp the metal, too little would change nothing. Eventually, the oil softened enough to be drained, emerging in thick, uneven clumps that confirmed just how thoroughly the cold had overtaken the machinery. Once the sump was empty, he flushed it with a small amount of the half-mixed blend from the night before, letting the thinner fluid wash through channels that hadn't seen movement in nearly 2 days. The moment was delicate, each step not just procedural, but essential to giving the engine any chance of turning. With the flush complete, Hensley wiped the dipstick clean, reinserted it, and performed a manual crank test. The crank resisted at first, straining against the cold, stiffened mechanisms, but after several firm attempts, it rotated an incremental 18 degrees. It was not much, but it was the first sign of movement in 48 hours, and to Hensley it felt like a door cracking open in a room long sealed shut. And he filled the engine with 5.5 quarts of the experimental mixture, watching the amber blend settle quickly, instead of clinging like the useless sludge it replaced. A pedal pump helped distribute the oil, pushing the thinner fluid through narrow passages that would have been unreachable an hour earlier. Meanwhile, the crew worked on the fuel system, thawing the lines by immersing them carefully in heated water cans and checking for any lingering ice that might choke the first spark. When everything reached the narrow threshold of readiness, the soldiers stepped back, giving Hensley space as he primed the carburetor with a 10cc syringe of fuel. The gesture was small but essential, the mechanical equivalent of a first breath. The silence that followed felt charged, every man waiting for a sign. Hensley engaged the starter. The engine turned once, slowly. With a groan of effort, Then again, this time catching a hint of rhythm, as a thin coil of blue smoke curled from the exhaust. The oil pressure gauge hesitated at the lower edge before climbing past 5 psi, a movement so slight, yet so vital, that it rippled through the watching men like a spark across dry tinder. One truck alive meant the battalion had more than hope. It meant mobility, the possibility of retrieving supplies, repositioning defenses, or evacuating the most vulnerable before the cold or the encirclement tightened further. Yet the moment's triumph carried its own shadow. When they moved to the second truck and attempted the same sequence, its starter ground to a halt, midway through the first rotation, refusing to budge despite repeated efforts. As the sound faded into the frozen air, Hensley understood with quiet clarity that the real challenge was only beginning. The true test was not in waking the first engine, it was in reviving the next 10, each with its own hidden frailties shaped by cold, age, and chance. Mid-morning brought a thin, pale light that finally pierced the forest canopy, scattering across the ice-coated branches like shards of fractured glass. The cold still held its grip, but the sunlight revealed the battalion's motor pool in a new way, a frozen assembly line where men moved with purpose, carrying buckets of the improvised oil mixture down rows of silent machines. Every step crunched with a brittle sound, each breath rising in sharp clouds as the soldiers formed an organized rhythm around the vehicles that had once seemed beyond saving. The early success of the first ignition attempts had shifted something in the atmosphere. What began as a desperate experiment was now becoming a coordinated effort rooted in method, urgency, and growing belief. Hensley began by establishing a triage system, ranking each vehicle according to its immediate strategic value. Transport trucks came first. They were essential for hauling ammunition, food, and those too weak to walk. Armored cars followed, their mobility vital for reconnaissance and defense if the battalion needed to shift its position quickly. The men understood this hierarchy without argument. They tightened their gloves, adjusted their scarves, and moved with steady determination, despite the ambient temperature hovering at -26 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind chill drove that number even lower, dipping to around -40, a level that punished exposed skin within minutes and made every task more demanding. Yet no one stepped back from the work. Intelligence reports filtered quietly through the morning, creating an undercurrent of urgency. German forces were pushing from the east with armor, closing distance faster than expected. The battalion had only hours, perhaps less, to regain mobility or risk becoming trapped in a pocket that froze tighter with each passing gust of wind. That knowledge fueled the pace, turning the motor pool into a living mechanism in which every man served a purpose. Some reheated the drained sludge to clear engine cavities. Others monitored gauges, careful to ensure that oil pressure held steady as engines reached cautious idle. Another group performed throttle cycling, maintaining just enough RPM for the thin film of the experimental mixture to keep bearings coated. The results came in patterns that were both encouraging and instructive. The first 4 vehicles started successfully, their engines warming into slow, uneven rhythm before settling into steady operation. 2 more followed, though each carried a faint bearing knock that hinted at the thin margin the mixture operated within. They were functional, but Hensley made a mental note to watch them closely. The most revealing moment came when an M8 armored car exhibited oil, foaming at high RPM, prompting him to adjust the blend to a 70-20-10 ratio, fine-tuning the mixture for a machine that demanded different tolerances. That quick recalibration reflected the nature of the moment, adaptation layered atop improvisation, refined by decades of instinct and an acute sense of consequence. As engines warmed, the landscape around the battalion changed. Trucks could now carry the injured to safer ground. Anti-tank guns could be repositioned. Ammunition could be redistributed without exhausting the men who had been hauling crates by hand only a day earlier. Innovation under pressure had become the binding force of the unit. But so had the simple, human willingness to trust one engineer's gamble for the sake of everyone. Then, just as the last armored car rumbled awake with a long-awaited vibration, a radio operator emerged from the command post, breath ragged and eyes urgent. He carried a message that tightened the air more than any frost. Enemy armor was 90 minutes away. Afternoon clouds gathered in heavy layers, thickening until the sky resembled dull steel stretched across the horizon. The light dimmed in a way that deepened every shadow, but the battalion no longer measured time by the sky. They measured it by the engines. Those fragile, improvised lifelines, idling in staggered rhythm along the forest road. Thin columns of exhaust curled upward, wavering like faint signals that the battalion still breathed. The sound was uneven, but alive, and in this cold, any sign of life mattered. Men moved quickly, yet carefully around the column, securing gear, checking tie-downs, and ensuring that no engine fell below the minimal temperature needed to keep the mixture from gelling. Hensley walked the line with a quiet intensity, touching hoods, reading gauges, listening for changes in tone that only his practiced ear would catch. Once the column formed, the battalion eased forward, every engine kept running without pause. The road ahead was a narrow ribbon, carved through 14 inches of snow, with an untreated layer of ice hidden beneath the surface. Each truck advanced in low gear at barely 12 miles per hour, careful not to strain the engines or the improvised oil mixture that had bought them this chance. Tires slipped, caught, then slipped again, but the vehicles pushed onward, one cautious rotation at a time. The cold had turned simple movement into an ordeal, yet the column held its shape. Hensley rode in the last vehicle, positioned there by choice so he could monitor the entire line. Oil pressure readings were relayed verbally from truck to truck, each crew calling out their numbers with steady precision. He listened intently, piecing together the condition of machines he could not see, mapping their lifelines by the rhythm of shouted readings. Drops in pressure were noted, rising temperatures tracked, all of it forming a quiet, mechanical pulse that guided his decisions. He leaned forward, studying his own gauge, comparing it against the values coming down the line, searching for patterns that might signal early signs of trouble. As they advanced, pockets of German infantry appeared on the distant tree line, brief, shifting figures that watched the column move. The battalion did not linger, did not turn, did not slow enough to invite confrontation. The simple fact that they were motorized allowed them to bypass these obstacles without direct engagement, slipping between shadows and snow while engines hummed just steadily enough to carry them through. Their movement was not a charge or a retreat. It was a deliberate, quiet threading of a narrow path that circumstance had nearly closed. Mechanical risks remained constant companions. The mixture's lower flashpoint meant even a minor surge in throttle could create dangerous vapor levels inside the crankcase. Hensley had warned every driver, emphasizing subtlety over speed, stability over urgency. Throttle discipline became its own form of survival, a mechanical steadiness that matched the emotional steadiness the moment demanded. After 11 miles of slow, calculated progress, a signal rippled backward through the column. The lead truck was overheating. The report struck with a weight Hensley immediately recognized. Too much heat, too soon, meant dilution of the oil film. By the time his vehicle reached the troubled truck, steam was beginning to rise. He worked swiftly, diagnosing the dilution by smell and texture, then redistributed what remained of the improvised blend to balance the pressure between vehicles. It was a fragile solution, but enough to keep the engine running just above failure. The battalion pressed on. Snow deepened in places, thinned in others, and the cold clung to every surface with relentless grip. Yet the engines continued, refusing to surrender the hard-earned momentum. After 38 continuous hours of running on unapproved oil, the column finally approached the ridge, where friendly artillery units held their line. The sight of reinforced positions brought a quiet relief that settled behind every heartbeat. When the final truck crested the ridge and shuddered to a weary stop, steam curling gently from its hood, the moment felt less like victory and more like the first breath after near suffocation. Fragile, exhausted, but undeniably alive. Days later, the cold finally began to loosen its grip. The sharp, metallic bite in the air softened, and as temperatures edged upward, the landscape revealed what the freeze had hidden. Abandoned positions thawed to expose frozen canteens cracked along their seams, ropes stiffened into brittle coils, and machine gun nests that now sat silent beneath the melting crust. Snow that once reflected the hard glare of survival now glistened with a muted sheen, as if the forest itself had shifted from tension to quiet release. The battalion gathered at a warmer, forward depot, a place where engines hummed with steady confidence once more. Their vehicles, drained of the experimental blend, now ran on regulation lubricant, sounding no different from any other machines in the theater. Nothing in their tone revealed how close they had come to failing. With the battalion stabilized, an investigation followed as expected. Officers examined the logs, questioned personnel, and noted the unauthorized oil modification with a measured formality. Regulations were clear, but so were the testimonies of the men who had worked through the cold nights. They described the unstartable engines, the rapidly closing threat from the east, and the impossible odds faced by a unit trapped between weather and encirclement. The inquiry documented every step, but even within its formal language, a quiet acknowledgement emerged. The decision had been necessary under extreme conditions. The rules had not accounted for a winter this severe, nor for the ingenuity required to survive it. Mechanical assessments painted a surprisingly optimistic picture. Only 2 engines required bearing replacements, their early knocking traced back to overnight conditions rather than the mixture itself. The rest remained fully serviceable, performing with the same reliability they had shown before the cold seized them. For Hensley, this outcome was validation, though he accepted it with the same calm that had guided him through each step of the crisis. When the final report was filed, he received no official commendation. His work was categorized simply as a pragmatic field adjustment, a phrasing that captured neither the risk taken nor the skill required, but one that fit neatly within the military structure that preferred uniformity over individual improvisation. Yet the story did not disappear. Over time, fragments of his effort filtered quietly into post-war training. Small unit maintenance manuals began to include guidelines for cold weather blending, echoing ratios remarkably similar to the ones he had formulated by lantern light. Engineering courses added sections on viscosity, flexibility, and pour point considerations, using scenarios built on the very challenges he had faced. The lesson was not about heroics, but about the practicality of adaptation, how survival sometimes depended on knowledge carried not from textbooks, but from barns, workshops, and long winters spent solving problems far from any battlefield. The human cost that had been avoided lingered as an unspoken weight. Officers later estimated that had the engines remained frozen, casualties from exposure or encirclement might have doubled. The battalion would have faced a far harsher outcome, not because of enemy fire, but because immobility in a landscape this unforgiving could be as deadly as any direct threat. The mixture had been unapproved, improvised, and risky, yet it had offered life where regulation could not. As the battalion prepared to move on, routine settled back into their days. New orders replaced old fears, and engines warmed under more predictable skies. But in one corner of the depot, on a shelf that rarely drew attention, sat a single, unmarked jerry can. It held no label, no official record, only a faint stain along its rim where an improvised blend once sloshed against cold metal. It remained there long after the unit departed, the last quiet trace of a mixture that had never been approved, yet had saved hundreds of lives. Stories like this one aren't just history, they're reminders of how far quiet courage can reach when nothing else stands between survival and silence. If you want more untold moments that hinge on ingenuity and grit, keep this journey alive the way you know best. And before you go, ask yourself one thing. If you were freezing in that tent with a battalion depending on you, would you trust an unapproved idea to save everyone?